Good, and now we are going to move forward and create visions of a more climate just and biodiverse future. The next session is curated by DocSociety and will also be moderated by DocSociety, meaning Megha Sood, head of climate story unit at DocSociety in the USA, and they will explore how to move beyond the monoculture of past climate narrative, heal the deep polarization amongst our community and activate audiences who have been often ignored. I'll let you together with Megha Sood of DocSociety. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Creating Visions of a More Climate Just and Biodiverse Future. We are so excited to be at CPH Docs, especially because this year's programming has such an emphasis on climate and biodiversity. My name is Megha Sood, and I am the head of the Climate Story Unit at DocSociety, which is an organization who's been supporting independent storytellers around the globe for over 15 years. I'm joined today by Fatima Ibrahim, the co-founder of the Green New Deal UK, who has been building unlikely coalitions across the country, Michael Premo, an artist and community engagement strategist based in Brooklyn, New York, who has been using multidisciplinary approaches to elevate important stories, and Maya Newell, a filmmaker and impact producer based in Australia, who has embedded collaborative storytelling practices across all of her work. We want to focus today's conversation on a series of provocations about how we as creatives and as an industry can reframe our understanding of the audiences that we need to engage, how we can move beyond the monoculture of past climate narratives, and how we can shift away from extractive storytelling practices. DocSociety is so excited to host this conversation because we believe in the role of cultural strategy to lead us towards social progress. Cultural strategy is how we rewrite those strongly held narratives. It's how we shape opinions and beliefs. It's how we build the political will for legislative outcomes. Culture is also the dimension where the relative importance of climate change compared to all other priorities has to be fought and won. But coming from a community of creatives, I have to admit that we've really struggled to keep climate change at the forefront. And we have definitely failed to reach the communities we actually need to engage. Acclaimed author Amitav Ghosh wrote, and quote, "When future generations look back, they will certainly blame the leaders and the politicians of this time for their failure to address the climate crises. But they may as well hold artists and writers to be equally culpable. For the imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats." Storytellers play a crucial role in framing how our societies understand both the crises of our time and their solutions. Storytelling is how we create shared meaning. But when you look back at some of the most popular climate stories of the past decade, you realize how monotonous they are, falling into common tropes, relying on trusted messengers who primarily are, quite frankly, white men from the global north. We keep serving the same population again and again while alienating the rest. We have been losing this cultural battle, and we can no longer do it alone. This is why we've launched the Climate Story Unit at DocSociety. It is a narrative shift initiative supporting transformative storytelling to advance a more climate just and biodiverse future. Across all of our programs, we are bringing together storytellers to work alongside impact producers and movement builders, climate scientists, and policymakers to have critical conversations about who are the audiences that we really need to be reaching, what are the most important narratives that need to be told now, and how do we ensure that these messages actually reach those that need to engage. We're all going to have to work together to shift the status quo. To bring this all to life, let's go to Fatima, who's been organizing communities who want to be part of the climate conversation, but often feel excluded. Fatima?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's so lovely to be with you and to be in this space talking about stories. My name is Fatima Ibrahim. I am based in London. It's the 29th of April, yet I'm wearing this jumper because it's absolutely freezing cold. So I hope you are all in warmer climates, but it's definitely freezing here in London. I am the co-director of Green New Deal UK, and it really says it on the tin. We're building a movement for a Green New Deal, which is an economy-wide plan, so a systemic approach to tackling environmental breakdown in a way that deals with the inequality at the heart of our economic system. And simply put, we're fighting for an economy that centers people and planet. And that vision has not been more important than it is today, as we have, spent a year fighting a pandemic that has laid bare the huge inequality in our societies. And so when I was asked to speak briefly about what communities need to be engaged in the climate conversation and how we do it, it felt apt for me to tell you about my own journey and to pull out 2 or 3 lessons that warrant reflection for all storytellers, whether you're a climate activist and campaigner like me, or whether you're in traditional media, or you're in the documentary world. I just want to take you back to a memory that I had in early 2019 when all over the world we were seeing young people taking to the streets, the youth strikers really bringing climate to the top of the agenda and inspiring us. And I felt inspired to join them. So in February 2019, I joined one of the first strikes that was happening in London. And I got up early, took the train, got there, and very quickly felt that I was in
unfamiliar territory. This was a climate protest, and I wasn't a minority. I had spent years organizing in the climate movement, have organized some of the biggest climate marches this country has seen, and yet I was experiencing something new. For the first time, the people that I was seeing and what I was seeing around central London was the London that I knew reflected back at me. Young people from across this wonderfully diverse city, from all kinds of schools, socioeconomic backgrounds, faiths, at a climate demonstration. What has, for me, often been a visible domain of white middle-class activists, this felt new and refreshing. And, I'm not embarrassed to say that I cried, and I had to sit down and ask myself a serious question. How had the climate strikers managed just in a few weeks to do what the NGO and the climate movement at large hadn't been able to do for decades? And in speaking to people and reading the placards and listening to the speeches that were happening, I wrote one of my first op-eds in ID magazine about my experience. And for me, the thing that became very clear is that the youth strikers weren't just talking about climate breakdown in isolation as an issue of us, relying on fossil fuels and needing to change how we power our economic system. But what they were talking about was a system that was not serving people, most people everywhere, and was also plundering our planet. They were talking about how a decade of austerity had dismantled and broken apart communities and made them less resilient. It was talking about a system that was keeping inner city children in our city inside, unable to play in their playgrounds because the air was too toxic to breathe. They were talking about a system that has resulted in the UK experiencing some of the highest levels of fuel poverty in Europe. And that these were choices by our government. And so what they were doing was talking about power. Who has it? How are they using it? And how we need to change that. And why that's an important narrative that unlocked, really, I think, their ability to reach new audiences and communities is that they were talking about people's lived experiences. They were talking about an experience of climate that stemmed beyond how we normally talk about it, which is rising sea levels and the ice caps melting, but everyday people's experiences of a system that wasn't serving them and wasn't serving the planet either. And I think that
that unlocks a lot, because you're immediately talking to people and seeing them and recognizing them and saying, you know what, this climate crisis isn't another problem on top of the problems that you're facing, but the climate crisis is also a symptom of a system that's also not serving you in lots of other ways. And it reminds me of the famous sort of bandied about term that came from the Gilets Jaunes movement, which is the fight, the end of what we're fighting against, the end of the planet, the end of the world, is the same as the problems that we're facing in terms of trying to fight to get to the end of the month. And I've completely cannibalized their phrase, but I think for me that really unlocks it, is that this is at the heart of the issue that we're facing is an economic system that's not serving people or planet. So I think the first lesson to take from that is we need to tell a more realistic and real and truthful story about what is going wrong and what has got us to this point, and what we fundamentally need to shift to change the trajectory of our existence on planet Earth. And in telling the truth, we reach more people. The second thing is, when we start telling the truth and we reach new people, the benefit of doing that is we're not trying to widen the climate movement for the sake of widening the climate movement. I'm being serious when I say we need everybody to change everything, because what we're up against is so vast, is so entrenched, that is going to take a popular social movement that is well equipped in order for us to dismantle the systems and rebuild them. And the beauty in reaching new communities is we find new solutions. Just prior to the pandemic, I was in a community in the north of England that has been flooded on several occasions and isn't getting much help from the central government. And I was just taken aback by how intimately they understood not just the climate crisis, but the inequality crisis and the solutions that they needed to protect their own community. And I was like, these are the people we need in power. These are the people we need on our TVs to tell us how the UK becomes more resilient to flooding, what sort of flood defense systems we need, how communities can work together better to make sure that they're resilient to some of the environmental breakdown we are going to face, because we're already really in the thick of it. And so that is another lesson that we need to take, is that we're not just engaging communities for the sake of engaging them, that we need them. We need them because one of the biggest things I think that stops people from joining or really feeling like they have a place in the climate movement is a lack of hope. And that's because we spend a lot of time talking about what is going wrong and find it very difficult to imagine a future beyond the way that we know the world works right now. And the truth is, there are places within our communities where those solutions are already thriving, but that we need to champion them and really put those stories at the center of a new world. And that's what the Green New Deal is about. It's a hopeful vision of the future, one that paints a realistic version of the world if we fight for it.
Thanks so much, Fatima. I know we're a bit tight on time, but that's a perfect segue to go to Michael Premo.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. It's an honor to be at this festival, and I love to hang out with my DocSociety family and talk about these critical issues of how we can help proliferate stories. I think one thing I like to say ad nauseum, perhaps, is that we need a storytelling ecosystem that is as diverse as the natural ecosystems we are trying to preserve. And very often, I think both parties come to, whether it's sort of financiers, broadcasters, funders, individuals affected by a particular issue in their community who are motivated to tell a story, or advocates and activists working in the space, is often fall into this trap of this notion of conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom would have us believe that there is a sort of limited way to tell this story. There's a limited way to be effective in communicating about all the issues we face. space, and that's just not true. It doesn't reflect how dynamic we are as a people, as storytellers, as individuals who want to receive and experience stories. And again, it doesn't sort of match the diversity of these ecosystems in which we live and breathe and want to continue to be able to live for generations to come. Um, I think very often it's attractive to be like, oh, okay, well, we need to reach the widest possible audience possible. And so that's not always the most effective way to communicate a message. I think when we're engaged in this work and considering which medium is correct for which story, we also might want to ask ourselves, what is it that we hope to achieve with the story? And I think DocSociety has this great impact field guide, which I think is at impactguide.org. I believe is the URL. It's the DocSociety Impact Field Guide that you can search in a search engine. And in that guide, there's a section that talks about analyze impact dynamics that you want to make with your work. Changing minds, changing structures, building community or building movements, or changing behaviors. And those don't encompass all of the plethora of ways that a project can have an impact, but it's a great place to start to really consider what it is that you want to achieve with a particular story you're making. And so I bring that up almost before talking about the proliferation of narratives and mediums, because for some people, it's really useful to sort of start at what you want to do to help inform how you go back to inform the process by which you engage to get those preferred outcomes. And so, there's a lot of different mediums that people enjoy. Digital platforms allow us to disseminate things broadly and widely, but that doesn't always mean that what you're sharing is being heard or making the impact that you want to. Often there's this impulse to go wide, but you can go wide, but that doesn't mean you're going deep. And sometimes you need to not sacrifice the impulse to go wide if you want to go deep and make a particular sort of impact in a particular community. And so I think in that vein as well, we often try to shoehorn stories into a medium that they don't necessarily want to be in. Like every story doesn't need to be a 60-minute, 90-minute feature-length film. You can be just as effective telling a story in a multitude of other forms, like a live installation or exhibit, podcast, audio, radio, live performance in theater as well. I think very often, particularly in the digital space, we just think that everything needs to be a feature film. But we've found, and there is some research out there about this, that shorter mediums are, if just as impactful, if perhaps not more effective in being able to communicate a message to a particular community. And I think that's really what's exciting about this time, is that there is so many different mediums, and the availability of technology has really allowed us to be able to sort of diversify and deepen the ways in which we are telling stories. And I think, building off what Fatima was saying about, we need all of these communities to help define and move this progress forward. We need stories that reflect that diversity as well. I'm sure in your personal life, you have friends who are maybe obsessed with podcasts, maybe obsessed with binging whatever the latest streaming thing is, and will watch 10 hours of content in a weekend, right? And so we need to have these things in all of these different platforms. And also, I think that there is an impulse from distributors and broadcasters and financiers that shorter form content means, oh, we just need to make a smaller investment because the shorter thing might cost less. And while certainly an hour and a half long film that takes 5 years to make might not cost as much as a short film, shorter form content doesn't automatically assume a lesser investment is required. And that might be counterintuitive, but if we could think about how we can make as an industry investment form content, or live performance or installation or mixed media content produced across a bunch of different platforms, but fund it at accurate levels so that the makers and storytellers and artists are, that's my timer, we can fund it at a level that ensures that the people that are making this work are receiving a living wage. That should also be part of of our commitment to the values of how to tell these stories, both diversely as well as making sure that artists and storytellers are able to be accurately compensated. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Michael. And that's a great segue into Maya Newell. She is actually based in Australia. It's the middle of the night for her, so we have a pre-record from her. Let's go ahead and play her video.
Hi, so my name's Maya Newell. I'm a filmmaker and impact producer from Australia. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal lands in which I'm tuning in from today, from beautiful Sydney, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Indeed, the land here in Australia was never ceded. I've been asked here to talk a little bit about the filmmaking practices that I've used in my films. I made 2 features, a film called Gaby Baby and another one called In My Blood It Runs, with beautiful teams of people. And I suppose just to start off a bit about extractive filmmaking. I think especially talking about the climate space, it's really commonly understood that we need to be pushing up against extractive industries that are contributing heavily to climate change. But really traditional filmmaking practices also are not exempt from these problematic systems and ways of thinking that have allowed this to happen. So I want to talk a bit about how our industry is also dominated by the same bias that society is. And much really of documentary filmmaking practices is based on these models of extractive storytelling and hierarchies that keep those in power at the top. I've been on a long journey to kind of recognise this more and try and adapt the ways that I make films. But things that have always sort of sat uncomfortably with me are things like in documentary storytelling, we're taught that it's okay to swoop in, tell a story or take a story and then leave again. We're taught that consent is this one-off decision that sort of happens often before you even pick up a camera, that paying participants would jeopardise the authenticity of a story, that we're taught that, stories are not our own to tell, we can take on without deep consideration about what that means and how we should approach that. And one of the key things as well is that we're often told that we shouldn't be revealing rough cuts to participants in films or before a film is finalised, even though that story is about who they are and how they walk in the world. So I suppose, really this is about questioning, and certainly in the climate justice space, where we're often telling stories of marginalised peoples who are on the front lines of really dire situations, who are courageously telling their stories and offering so much with so little. I suppose for me the question became, why are we not trained as filmmakers to empower those people on the front lines and to really think about agency? How do we educate those in our films to understand filmmaking practices and also distribution processes and impact processes? And I do believe that through that process of agency is how we actually make more successful campaigns, because the people in it are so invested in the task at hand and they feel, like equals in that process. So I suppose what I'm talking about is really collaborative filmmaking and co-design, which is really important to say up front is certainly not something that's new, and it's something that a way of working that has been led for many, many generations, largely by artists of colour, largely by First Nations filmmakers who have always worked in this way. But I think those projects are often set aside, or we're told that they're kind of just community projects. They're not like real art or something. I've in particular learned so much from working with Rachel Edwardson, from Larissa Barrent, who are the leading producers on my latest documentary, In My Blood It Runs. But just a step back, I suppose it's nice to have real examples of this. And when I was making Gaby Baby, that was my first feature. It's about children being raised in same-sex families, queer families, in the midst of the marriage equality debate in Australia. That's my story. I've got 2 lesbian mums, and we found that our voices as children in these families were missing from the public debate, and everyone, decided that they knew what it was like, that we were damaged in some way by our parents. And that film was really a moment to take hold of our own representation and tell the public what our lives were like. And while that film was not me in the film, it was 4 beautiful 10-year-olds navigating the world, I learned really the power of representation and just how important it is to get that right. And so we worked really collaboratively with those young people who then went on to, design and model their own stories, and also the campaign for the film, which incidentally got us banned by the government. But then moving on to In My Blood It Runs, that was made collaboratively with all the Arundel Garoa families in that film. It's about a young Garoa Aboriginal boy growing up in Alice Springs in the Central Desert. And we, with the leadership of Rachel, who is one of the First Nations producers, we designed a model of collaboration which centred the family at every decision, I suppose, and in workshops before we even picked up the camera, through rough cut, through fine cut. We had an amazing model of, I suppose, sharing profits and fees, which is something that we don't often do in documentary, but makes a lot of sense. Those people have given so much of their time, and it's a real fallacy to say that, people would only do it for the money and therefore your story is inauthentic. But I suppose the main point there is that it was a whole model, which was, we sat down with the families at the start and then continued and adapted that and changed it. Things like longer timelines to allow for that collaboration to happen, things like a massive advisory team who were a support network for those people in the family, so that all of that representation didn't sit solely on them. The idea of ongoing release, so that, especially working with a young child, that release form was signed on over and over again as he grew up and had a more broader understanding of what it meant to be in a film and to be exposed in that way. Rachel led a lot of the work around cultural safety. So how do we actually educate our own team on the biases that we hold about First Nations people, and how do we learn from and create some formal opportunities for those families to teach us about what we need to know to even begin to consider how to make this film. So I suppose those are just some examples. And I know we've got a very short period of time to talk, so I won't go on, but it really is the tip of the iceberg. And I think that we have so much to learn as filmmakers, as an industry that, supports this idea of the auteur, and there's, one person that leads everything and receives all of the, glory of film. I've learnt, a lot about how collaborative filmmaking and that process of sharing power in a film really benefits everyone. And I just thought I'd finish with a really beautiful quote from William Tilmouth, who's an Arundel leader and one of Dwan's families from In My Blood It Runs. He said, after the process of working on the film, we tell our stories in paintings, song, dance, and film. This film shows us that consultation and collaboration work. Both parties wanted to do it. Dwan wanted a film about him, and the film team put aside ego, professionalism, learnings, and tried to relearn a new way. This was the vehicle in which the family told their story. They drove it where they want it to go, and I'm quite proud of it, actually.
Thank you, Fatima, Michael, and Maya, for your provocations. While we are unable to get to your questions today, we have some prompts for you to reflect upon. We are about to embark on a massive rebuild of society. Everything that we were told before the pandemic that wasn't possible no longer stands true. We now have permission to dream bigger. We have to. So as you leave this session and go back to your teams and have conversations with your peers across the industry, we challenge you to rethink who are the audiences that our stories actually need to reach in order for meaningful climate action to occur. We challenge you to be bold in the creation, production, and distribution of new types of stories that break all the tropes that currently dominate our media. And we challenge you to truly support and provide the resources to enable ethical and collaborative storytelling practices. Let's all work together to shape a cultural strategy that leads us toward more just and equitable climate solutions. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Megha, Fatima, Michael, and Maya for this talk. And it was really great to see that you were bridging also representation power to climate rebellion. I was saying everything is intertwined. So that's very good angle. And I love the we challenge you.